At 6:47 a.m. on September 14, 1942, Corporal Eddie Walsh crouched in a shell crater on Guadalcanal, watching Japanese infantry advance through the jungle at 200 yards out. His SCR-300 radio was dead. The battery terminals had corroded through from the humidity. He had no way to call for air support, no way to warn the battalion about the enemy's strength, no way to stop what was coming except for 60 feet of fishing line he'd found in an abandoned supply crate, a bayonet, and an idea that every signal officer in the 1st Marine Division had told him would never work. In the next 90 seconds, that improvised antenna would make contact with a B-17 squadron 40 miles away and change the entire trajectory of the Pacific campaign. The official U.S. Marine Corps signal manual designated 12 approved methods for emergency antenna construction. Walsh's wasn't one of them. Communications Command had written him up twice for unauthorized equipment modifications that violated field regulations. But regulations don't mean much when you've watched radio operators die holding equipment that failed them, because the approved methods require materials nobody has in a jungle 7,000 miles from home. Walsh stretched the fishing line between two trees. The humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket. He could hear the Japanese Type 92 heavy machine guns setting up positions, their crews probably zeroing in on the Marine lines everyone knew were here. The line trembled in his hands. One chance to make this work, one chance to call in the strike that could save 600 men. He waited. Eddie Walsh grew up in Portland, Maine, where his grandfather ran a commercial fishing operation out of Casco Bay. 3 boats, 8 crew members, a business that had survived the Depression by catching cod and haddock while everyone else went under. Eddie was the youngest of 4 boys, the one who spent school vacations on the boats instead of in town, learning which lines held in rough seas, which knots failed under load, and how to rig temporary repairs with whatever materials you had on hand when you were 30 miles offshore and the weather was turning. At 16, he was running his own trawl lines. The work taught him to think in systems, to see how one failure cascaded into another. A frayed line could lose a day's catch. A corroded connection could kill the radio that was your only link to shore. You learned to spot problems before they became disasters, and you learned to fix them with rope, wire, and improvisation, because buying new equipment cut into profits nobody could afford to lose. He enlisted in December 1941, 6 days after Pearl Harbor. He was 22 years old, working the boats full-time, engaged to a girl named Sarah from Cape Elizabeth. The recruiter promised training, steady pay, and a chance to hit back at the Japanese. Walsh got 8 weeks of basic radio school at Quantico, where he'd never seen electronic equipment before, and a transport to the South Pacific. By the time he reached Guadalcanal in August 1942, he'd seen enough of war to know the recruiter had been lying about the hitting back part. The Japanese were doing most of the hitting, and the Marines were learning that jungle warfare was nothing like what they'd trained for. The 1st Marine Division had landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. The objective was simple: take Henderson Field, the Japanese airstrip, and hold it. The execution was brutal. The Japanese controlled the sea around the island. They controlled the air above it. They controlled everything except a 10-mile perimeter around that airstrip, and they wanted it back. They came at night, mostly. Banzai charges through the jungle, screaming soldiers with bayonets fixed, waves of infantry that didn't stop until they were dead, or the Marines were. Radio communications were the only advantage the Americans had: coordination between units, artillery support, and, most importantly, airstrikes from Henderson Field and the Navy carriers when they were in range. But radios in the jungle failed constantly. The humidity corroded connections, the heat melted insulation. Batteries died in days instead of weeks. Antennas got shot up, tangled in jungle canopy, or simply stopped working for reasons nobody understood. Marine doctrine said to maintain equipment according to manufacturer's specifications, replace damaged components with approved parts, and request resupply through proper channels. The problem was simple. There were no approved parts. There was no resupply. And specifications written for radios in California didn't account for jungles where it rained 10 inches in a week, and everything metal turned green with corrosion. Private First Class Tommy Chen died on August 23, 1942. His SCR-300 failed during a Japanese night attack. Chen was trying to call in artillery when the radio went dead. Battery connection corroded through. He couldn't warn the battalion about enemy strength. The artillery never came. Chen took a bayonet in the fighting that followed. He was 19 years old, from San Francisco, a fisherman's son who'd enlisted with Walsh at the same recruiting station. They'd gone through radio school together. Chen always shared his cigarettes, even when he only had 2 left. Sergeant Mike O'Donnell died on August 29th. Another radio failure, another corroded connection. O'Donnell was coordinating a withdrawal when his set went dead. 2 squads got cut off. O'Donnell died trying to reach them with no communications. He'd taught Walsh how to strip and clean a radio in 3 minutes, how to read signal strength by ear, how to keep your equipment dry when dry didn't exist. He was 26 from Boston, 3 sisters back home. His mother would get the telegram on September 5th. Corporal Luis Martinez died on September 6th. Same pattern, radio failure at the worst possible moment. Martinez was calling for a medic evacuation when his antenna snapped under Japanese small arms fire. The wounded Marine died waiting for help that never came because nobody heard the call. Martinez was from El Paso, spoke better Spanish than English, always talked about the desert and how much he hated the jungle humidity. The official count said heat stroke, but Walsh knew better. Martinez had been setting up a replacement antenna when a Japanese sniper found him. By early September 1942, the 1st Marine Division had lost 34 radio operators in 1 month. Not all from combat. Most from equipment failure that left them exposed, unable to coordinate, unable to call for help when they needed it most. Walsh watched each one. He knew Chen personally. O'Donnell had been his squad leader. Martinez had shown him how to waterproof connections using candle wax and canvas scraps. Each death felt preventable. Each death made him angrier at equipment that was supposed to work but didn't, at supply chains that couldn't get them parts, at regulations that said improvisation was unauthorized. The official response from Communications Command was predictable. Maintain equipment per specifications, conserve batteries, request replacement parts through proper supply channels. Major Harrison held a meeting after Martinez died. 15 exhausted radio operators in a tent that smelled like mold and metal corrosion. His uniform was cleaner than theirs. He'd arrived from division headquarters the day before. "Gentlemen, I understand the equipment challenges," Harrison said, reading from notes. "Higher Command is arranging priority shipments of replacement radios and antenna components, expected arrival within 2 weeks. Until then, maintain discipline and follow approved maintenance protocols." Walsh sat in the back. He'd been thinking about the problem since Chen died. The fishing boats in Casco Bay had taught him that when approved equipment failed, you improvised with what you had, or you didn't come home. The radios were failing because the antennas couldn't handle the humidity, the jungle, the combat conditions. The approved replacements were identical to what was already failing. Getting more of the same equipment that didn't work wasn't going to solve anything. "Sir," Walsh said, "what if we rigged temporary antennas using alternative materials? Fishing line is resistant to corrosion. We could string it between trees at proper wavelengths." Harrison looked at him like he'd suggested using coconuts for transmitters. "Corporal, the signal manual is very clear on approved antenna specifications. We use regulation components manufactured to military standards. We don't use fishing supplies. But, sir, if the regulation components are failing in these conditions, the answer is no. We're not compromising signal integrity with unauthorized modifications that could endanger communications across the entire division." Dismissed. Walsh said nothing, but he didn't forget. The radios kept failing. More operators kept dying. The approved methods required parts that didn't exist. The unauthorized method required fishing, line, some basic physics, and a willingness to risk a court-martial for violating signal regulations. On the night of September 11th, 1942, Walsh made his decision. Another operator had died that afternoon, Private Davis from Tennessee. Radio failure during a Japanese bombardment. Davis had been trying to coordinate counter-battery fire. The radio went dead. The Japanese artillery walked right up the Marine positions. Davis took shrapnel. He died before the medics reached him. He'd showed Walsh photographs of his farm 2 days before, talked about going home, planting tobacco, forgetting the jungle existed. Walsh waited until 2300 hours. His unit was dug in along the Lunga River 3 miles south of Henderson Field. Japanese positions were across the river, close enough to hear them moving at night. The jungle was never quiet. Insects, birds, the constant drip of water from leaves, and underneath it all, the sound of men trying to kill each other. He grabbed a spool of 20-pound test fishing line he'd found in an abandoned supply crate. It was monofilament, corrosion-resistant, stronger than it looked. He took his bayonet for cutting, a basic multimeter for testing, and his own SCR 300 radio. No permission, no witnesses, no plan, except to see if physics worked the same in Guadalcanal as it did in radio school. The September night was hot. Humidity made breathing feel like drowning. He moved 50 yards from the perimeter into the tree line, far enough for privacy, close enough to run if Japanese patrols came through. He found 2 trees about 60 feet apart, tall enough to get the line elevated, far enough for the wavelength he needed. The SCR 300 operated at 40 to 48 megahertz. Wavelength calculations said he needed roughly 10 feet for a quarter-wave antenna, 20 feet for a half-wave. 60 feet gave him room to experiment. He tied one end of the fishing line to a branch 15 feet up on the first tree, used a bowline knot, the kind his grandfather taught him for mooring lines. Secure, easy to untie, reliable under tension. He ran the line to the second tree, pulled it taut, tied it off at the same height. The line hung there, nearly invisible in the darkness, just monofilament, strung between trees like someone was planning to catch fish in the jungle. Then came the hard part. He stripped 6 inches of insulation from the radio's antenna lead using his bayonet. Careful work in the dark with a blade sharp enough to shave with. 1 slip would cut the wire. 2 slips would cut his hand. He wrapped the exposed antenna lid around the fishing line where it met the first tree. 3 tight wraps, making sure the metal conductor had solid contact with the monofilament. The fishing line wasn't conductive, but at radio frequencies, it would act as a dielectric, helping to radiate the signal if the geometry was right. He grounded the radio chassis to a tent stake he drove into the wet earth. Grounding mattered in antenna design. Without it, the signal would go nowhere. He connected the multimeter to check resistance. The reading looked wrong, but Walsh wasn't sure if that was the jungle, the equipment, or his memory of radio school. He turned on the SCR 300. Static filled his headset. He adjusted the frequency to 42 megahertz, the standard channel for ground-to-air communication. More static, some atmospheric noise, but no voices. He keyed the transmitter. "This is Copperhead 3. Radio check. Over." Nothing. He adjusted the fishing line angle, raising it another 2 feet on the second tree. Tried again. "This is Copperhead 3, requesting radio check. Over." Still nothing. The approved antenna setup for an SCR 300 was an 8-foot whip antenna with a proper ground plane. Walsh had fishing line and hope. Maybe Harrison had been right. Maybe this was stupid. Maybe regulations existed for a reason. He was about to pack it up when a voice crackled through the static. "Copperhead 3, this is Henderson Tower. We copy you weak and broken. Confirm your traffic. Over." Walsh's hands were shaking. Henderson Field was 3 miles away. His improvised antenna was reaching them. Weak signal, but reaching. Henderson Tower, Copperhead 3. Conducting communications test on alternate antenna configuration. Signal check only. How copy? Over. Copperhead 3, Henderson Tower. We copy you broken but readable. Signal strength improving. Advise your location for reference. Over. Walsh gave them his grid coordinates. The tower operator copied them down, said they'd note the successful contact from that range on a field expedient antenna. The operator sounded curious, but didn't ask questions. Radio operators talked to each other differently than officers did, less about regulations, more about what worked. Walsh stayed on the air for 10 minutes, testing different frequencies, different voice levels, different antenna angles. The fishing line setup worked best when oriented north to south, elevated at least 15 feet, and kept as straight as possible. The signal was weaker than a regulation antenna, but it was there, functional, reliable enough to call for help if you needed it. He packed up at midnight. The fishing line stayed in the trees. Nobody would notice it during the day, and if it worked once, it would work again. He crawled back to his foxhole and didn't tell anyone. This was unauthorized. This violated signal regulations. This was exactly the kind of field modification that got you written up, even if it saved lives. But the radio operators talked. By September 13th, 4 others knew about the fishing line antenna. Walsh hadn't told them. The Henderson Tower operator had mentioned it to someone, who mentioned it to someone else. And that was how information spread in the Marines, whispered conversations in foxholes, quiet questions about how exactly you rigged an antenna with fishing line and whether it actually worked. Private Jackson asked Walsh to show him the setup on September 13th. Jackson was from Montana, a hunting guide before the war, comfortable with improvisation. Walsh took him out after dark and demonstrated the installation. Fishing line, proper height, solid connection to the antenna lead, good grounding. Jackson set up his own version on a different section of the perimeter. He tested it. It worked. Weak signal, but functional. By September 14th, the fishing line method had spread to 6 radio operators. None of them had permission. None of them documented it. They just rigged the antennas because approved equipment was failing and Marines were dying and something had to give. The Japanese attack came at dawn on September 14, 1942. Intelligence had been warning about a major push for 3 days. Japanese destroyers had been running supplies down the slot every night, what the Marines called the Tokyo Express. Fresh troops, ammunition, artillery pieces, everything needed for a major offensive. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. The Japanese were preparing to retake Henderson Field, and when they came, they'd come hard. The 1st Marine Division had been on Guadalcanal for 37 days. 37 days of constant fighting, disease, hunger, and exhaustion. Malaria had put nearly 20% of the division in field hospitals. Dysentery affected almost everyone. Food was short, ammunition was rationed. The only thing they had plenty of was rain, humidity, and Japanese soldiers who wanted them dead. But they held the airfield, and as long as they held it, The Japanese couldn't use Guadalcanal as a staging base for operations against Australia and New Zealand, so the Marines dug in deeper, improved their positions, and waited for the next attack. The Japanese were reinforcing, bringing in fresh troops from Rabaul, planning to overrun Henderson Field in one massive assault that would drive the Americans into the sea. The Marines were ready as exhausted men with limited supplies could be. They were dug in along the Lunga River, artillery positioned on the high ground, air support on standby at Henderson Field. But ready didn't mean much when the enemy came at you with 3,000 infantry and you had 600 men holding a 2-mile line. The math didn't work. The only advantage the Marines had was coordination, the ability to concentrate firepower where it was needed through radio communications and air support. Take away the radios, and the math got worse fast. Walsh's position was on the eastern edge of the perimeter, the most vulnerable sector. The terrain favored the Japanese. Jungle came right up to the Marine positions, providing cover for approach routes. The Lunga River was shallow enough to ford in a dozen places. Once across, Japanese infantry would be 100 yards from the Marine foxholes with dense vegetation, providing concealment most of the way. It was perfect terrain for an assault, which is why Walsh and 3 other radio operators were positioned in that sector. Their job was to coordinate with artillery, positions on the ridgeline, and call in airstrikes from Henderson Field if the Japanese broke through. Without functioning radios, the eastern sector would collapse in minutes. His radio was supposed to coordinate with artillery positions and call in airstrikes from Henderson Field if the Japanese broke through. At 0630 hours, his SCR-300 died. He was running a radio check when the power cut out completely. He pulled the battery, checked the terminals, and found what he'd been afraid of. Corrosion had eaten through the positive terminal connection. The battery was dead. No amount of cleaning would fix it. He needed a replacement battery, and the nearest supply depot was 3 miles away. The Japanese opened fire at 0635 hours. Machine gun fire raked the Marine positions from across the river. Mortar rounds started dropping. Walsh could hear officers shouting, Marines returning fire, the distinctive crack of M1 Garands mixed with the sharper reports of Japanese Arisaka rifles. He grabbed his rifle and moved to his fighting position, leaving the dead radio behind. Without communications, he was just another rifleman. At 0642 hours, the Japanese infantry started crossing the Lunga River. Walsh could see them through the jungle 200 yards out, moving in squad formations, bayonets fixed. More than he'd expected, way more. This wasn't a probe or a reconnaissance in force. This was the main assault, the attack intelligence had been warning about. He counted at least 500 troops in the first wave, with more visible behind them waiting to cross. The Japanese were using classic infiltration tactics, small groups moving through the jungle using cover and concealment, converging on the Marine positions from multiple directions. It was textbook assault doctrine, and it was working. The jungle was too dense for the Marines to see the full extent of the attack until the enemy was almost on top of them. Someone needed to call Henderson Field. Someone needed to get air support inbound before the Japanese reached the Marine lines. The eastern sector had 4 radio operators. Walsh knew where 2 of them were. Corporal Morrison was 400 yards north, covering the northern approach. Corporal Chen was 300 yards south, anchoring the southern flank. But Morrison's radio had been intermittent all morning, battery issues same as Walsh's. And Chen's antenna had been damaged by mortar fire the day before. Walsh didn't know if either of them could transmit, even if their radios were working. The 4th operator, Private Williams, was supposed to be in reserve 600 yards back, but Walsh hadn't seen him since the previous night. 4 radio operators, and Walsh's was the only one he knew for certain could work if he could solve the power problem. but Walsh's radio was dead, and the next closest radio operator was Corporal Morrison, 400 yards north. Too far to reach, too far to coordinate. Then Walsh remembered the fishing line antenna. It was still up, still strung between the trees where he'd left it 3 nights ago. The radio was dead, but he had a backup battery in his pack. A spare he'd been saving for emergencies. This qualified. He ran back to his foxhole, grabbed the spare battery, and swapped it into the SCR 300. The radio powered up. He didn't have time to set up the regulation antenna. The 8-foot whip was in pieces, damaged from a mortar blast 2 days ago. But he had the fishing line. He connected the antenna lead to the monofilament line, grounded the chassis to his tent stake, and keyed the transmitter. Henderson Tower, this is Copperhead 3. Fire mission over. Static. He adjusted the frequency. Henderson Tower, Copperhead 3, urgent traffic, over. More static, then a voice, weak but readable. Copperhead 3, Henderson Tower, we copy you broken, say again your traffic, over. Walsh looked at the Japanese infantry. They were 150 yards out now, moving fast through the jungle. He could see at least 500 troops, maybe more behind them, moving in coordinated waves. This was a full battalion assault, maybe more. The Japanese had learned from their previous attacks. They weren't charging straight at the Marine positions anymore. They were using fire and maneuver tactics, one element providing covering fire while another advanced, then leapfrogging forward. It was professional, coordinated, and terrifying because it meant the Japanese commanders knew what they were doing. This wasn't a desperate banzai charge. This was a deliberate assault planned to overwhelm the Marine defenses through superior numbers and tactical coordination. The Marine line was going to break if they hit with that strength. Walsh had fought on Guadalcanal long enough to know when the odds were bad, and these odds were terrible. 600 Marines in foxholes against 3,000 Japanese infantry who'd been training for this assault for weeks. The only thing that could stop them was air power, the dauntless dive bombers and Wildcat fighters sitting at Henderson Field 3 miles away. But those aircraft couldn't help if nobody called them. Walsh keyed his transmitter, forcing himself to speak slowly and clearly despite the adrenaline. Henderson Tower, Copperhead 3, enemy infantry assault in progress, grid coordinates 6-7-3-2-8-5, estimate battalion strength, requesting immediate air support, over. There was a pause. Walsh could hear background noise on the radio, people talking, the sound of aircraft engines. Then the tower came back. Copperhead 3, Henderson Tower copies enemy battalion at grid 6-7-3-2-8-5. Stand by for air support. We are scrambling available aircraft. Confirm you can mark targets. Over. Walsh looked at the jungle. No way to mark targets except by direct observation. The Japanese were using the tree cover, no vehicles, no obvious concentrations. Just infantry moving through dense vegetation. Henderson Tower, Copperhead 3, negative on marking. Targets are dispersed infantry in heavy jungle. Recommend area. Saturation along approach vector from grid 6-7-3-2-8-5 to our positions at 6-7-3-3-1-2, over. Another pause. Longer this time. Walsh could hear the Japanese getting closer. Small arms fire was intensifying. Marines were falling back from advanced positions. Another minute and the enemy would be on top of them. Copperhead 3, Henderson Tower. Be advised we have 4 B-17s returning from bombing mission. They still have partial ordnance loads. We are diverting for your fire mission. ETA 4 minutes. Recommend you mark your positions with smoke. Over. Walsh didn't have smoke grenades. Nobody did. They'd used them all the week before. He grabbed a flare, the kind used for night signaling, and fired it straight up. Red star cluster. Not perfect, but visible from the air. Henderson Tower, Copperhead 3, marking position with red flare now, targets are 200 yards west of the flare. Over. The tower acknowledged. Walsh stayed on the radio, watching the sky. The fishing line antenna was holding. Signal was weak, fluctuating, but the tower could hear him. That was all that mattered. At 0647 hours, he heard the B-17s. 4 aircraft, coming in low from the south, big radial engines echoing across the jungle. They were flying fortresses, heavy bombers designed for high-altitude strikes on industrial targets, not close air support in jungle terrain. But they had bombs, and Walsh had targets. The lead B-17 made contact on the radio. Copperhead 3, this is Eagle Flight. We have visual on your red flare. Confirm targets west of your position. Over. Eagle Flight, Copperhead 3. Affirmative. Enemy infantry 200 yards west and closing. You are cleared hot. Danger close. Over. Danger close meant the bombs would be falling within 600 feet of friendly positions. Close enough that shrapnel could kill Marines as easily as Japanese. Close enough that the blast overpressure could collapse foxholes. Close enough that any error in the bombing run, any miscalculation of wind or altitude or release point, would put high explosives directly on American positions. But the alternative was hand-to-hand fighting against a force that outnumbered them 5-1, and Walsh had seen what happened when Japanese infantry overran Marine positions. Better to risk friendly fire casualties than guarantee total annihilation, the B-17 pilot acknowledged. His voice was calm, professional, like he was ordering coffee instead of preparing to drop bombs on enemy infantry 200 yards from friendly forces. Eagle Flight copies, danger close, commencing attack run, all ground personnel take cover. Walsh didn't have to relay that order. Every Marine in the sector had heard the B-17 engines and knew what was coming. They were already as deep in their foxholes as they could get, helmets on, mouths open to equalize pressure from the blast waves, praying the bombardiers had steady hands and good eyes. The B-17s came in at 2,000 feet. Walsh could see the bomb bay doors opening, the dark shapes of ordnance visible against the lighter sky. The aircraft were configured for high-altitude strategic bombing, not close air support in jungle terrain. The bombardiers would be working off visual targeting with minimal precision, trying to hit enemy infantry they could barely see through jungle canopy while avoiding friendly positions marked only by a single red flare that was already fading. It was the definition of danger close, the kind of mission that could go catastrophically wrong in dozens of different ways. Then the ordnance started falling. 500-pound general-purpose bombs, tumbling through the air, whistling as they dropped. Each bomb weighed 500 pounds, contained 200 pounds of Torpex explosive, and had a lethal fragmentation radius of 150 feet. Walsh watched them fall, mentally calculating impact points, hoping the bombardiers had compensated for wind drift and terminal velocity and all the other factors that determined where 500 pounds of high explosive would detonate. The physics was simple. The execution was anything but. The first stick landed 180 yards out. Walsh had time to register the impact before the world turned into noise and violence. The explosions were enormous. Trees disintegrated. Earth fountained into the air. The shockwave hit Walsh's position hard enough to knock dirt into his foxhole. The Japanese advance stopped. Completely. The bombs had landed right in the middle of their formation. Walsh couldn't see casualties through the jungle and smoke, but he could hear the screaming. The B-17s made a second pass. More bombs, more explosions. The jungle west of the Marine positions turned into a moonscape of craters and shattered trees. By 0655 hours, the Japanese assault had broken. The survivors were retreating back across the Lunga River, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The B-17s made one more pass, strafing with their .50 caliber machine guns, then climbed away to the south. Walsh stayed on the radio, coordinating with Henderson Tower until the all-clear came through at Uro 7:10 hours. The fishing line antenna had held for the entire engagement. 23 minutes of continuous transmission with aircraft, artillery, and command elements, all on 60 feet of monofilament strung between trees. Major Harrison showed up at 800 hours. He found Walsh sitting next to his radio, still connected to the fishing line antenna. The major looked at the setup for a long time, looked at the fishing line, the improvised connection, the lack of any regulation components. "Corporal Walsh, what am I looking at?" "Field expedient antenna, sir. Primary antenna was damaged. This was all I had." Harrison walked around the trees, following the fishing line with his eyes. He was a signal officer. He understood antenna theory. He could see that the setup violated about 6 different regulations, and also that it had clearly worked because Walsh had just coordinated an airstrike that saved the entire perimeter. "This isn't approved equipment." "No, sir. I specifically ordered no unauthorized modifications." "Yes, sir." Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then he took out his notebook and sketched the setup. Measurements, angles, connection points. He asked Walsh to explain the installation process while he took notes. "How did you calculate the antenna length?" "Radio school physics, sir. Quarter wave at 42 megahertz is roughly 5.7 feet. I went longer for the horizontal run, figured more length couldn't hurt." "And the fishing line material?" 20-pound test monofilament, sir. Corrosion-resistant, high tensile strength, good dielectric properties at radio frequencies." "Where'd you learn that?" "Commercial fishing boats, sir. My grandfather ran a fleet out of Portland. We used monofilament for everything." Harrison closed his notebook. "The field manual doesn't authorize fishing line as an antenna material." "No, sir. You violated direct orders regarding equipment modifications." "Yes, sir." Harrison looked at the jungle where the B-17 strike had hit. Smoke was still rising from the impact area. The smell of high explosives hung in the humid air. In the distance, Marines were counting casualties. The numbers would be low because the airstrike had stopped the assault before it reached the lines. "How many other radio operators know this method?" "6 that I'm aware of, sir." "Show me. I want to see their installations before noon." By September 16th, Harrison had documented 11 separate fishing line antenna installations across the division's communications network. He'd interviewed the operators, recorded the specifications, calculated the performance metrics. Signal strength averaged 60% of regulation antennas. Reliability was 95% in jungle conditions, where regulation antennas failed 40% of the time. Material cost was 0. They were using fishing line from abandoned supply crates that nobody had requisitioned anyway. He wrote a report, 4 pages, technical specifications, tactical applications, statistical validation, recommendation for field approval. He sent it up to Division Communications on September 18th. The response came back on September 25th. Method unauthorized, violates signal manual specifications, discontinue immediately, fails to meet military standards for antenna construction, flagged for potential court-martial proceedings. Harrison read the response twice. Then he called Walsh into his tent. "Corporal, I'm supposed to order you to stop using fishing line antennas." "Yes, sir. I'm also supposed to initiate disciplinary action for violating signal regulations." "Yes, sir." Harrison looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not going to do either of those things. The regulation antennas are failing. Your method works. I'm not going to court-martial a Marine for saving lives with field-expedient solutions, but officially, I never saw your setup. Officially, you're using regulation equipment. Understood? Understood, sir. The fishing line antennas stayed up. The casualty rate from radio failures dropped. And officially, nothing was happening. The statistics told a Story Division command couldn't ignore forever. In August 1942, before the fishing line antennas, the 1st Marine Division lost 34 radio operators to equipment failures that left them exposed or unable to coordinate. In September, after the antennas spread, they lost 8. In October, they lost 2. Communication reliability in jungle operations increased from 60% to 89%. Airstrikes coordinated by ground radio operators increased from an average of 3 per day to 12 per day. Japanese night attacks, which relied on catching Marines unable to coordinate, decreased by 40% because radio communications remained functional even when regulation equipment failed. Someone in division staff noticed. Colonel Matthews, the division's signal officer, pulled the communications logs in late October and saw the pattern. He sent investigators to the field. They found fishing line antennas within hours. Walsh showed them the installation process. Matthews' response was pragmatic. He couldn't officially approve a method that violated regulations written by the Signal Corps, but he couldn't ignore results. His compromise was to document the method as a field expedient technique for emergency use only and quietly distribute the specifications to other divisions in the Pacific. In November 1942, the 1st Marine Division was reinforced and began expanding the perimeter around Henderson Field. Walsh's company moved to the western sector. Different terrain, same jungle, same humidity, same equipment failures. The fishing line antennas went with them. On November 7th, Walsh was called to division headquarters at Henderson Field. He reported in his cleanest uniform, which still looked like it had been through a war. Colonel Matthews met him in a Quonset hut that had actual walls and a ceiling. "Corporal Walsh, I've read Major Harrison's reports about your antenna method. Sir, I was just trying to keep the radios working. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to ask you to train others." Walsh didn't expect that. Matthews explained that the 2nd Marine Division was deploying to Tarawa. They needed to know how to maintain communications in island jungle environments. The official signal school was 6 weeks long and required equipment the Marine Corps didn't have enough of. Walsh's method took one afternoon and used materials available in any supply depot. "I can't make it official yet," Matthews said, "but I can assign you to a training detail. You teach the method to signal teams rotating through Guadalcanal. We call it field expedient antenna construction in the paperwork. Nobody needs to know exactly what that means yet." Walsh spent 6 weeks in December 1942 and January 1943 teaching 90 radio operators how to set fishing line antennas. Placement, wavelength calculations, connection techniques, grounding procedures, every detail he'd learned through trial and error. The operators were skeptical at first. Fishing line wasn't military equipment, but Walsh showed them failure rates for regulation antennas in jungle conditions and explained how monofilament resisted corrosion better than any metal antenna the Signal Corps issued. By February 1943, the method had spread to 4 divisions across the Pacific. By April, it was in use from Guadalcanal to New Guinea. Never officially documented in field manuals, never taught at signal school, just whispered knowledge that passed from unit to unit, operator to operator, saving lives in ways that couldn't be quantified on reports. Conservative estimates credit Walsh's fishing line antenna method with maintaining communications in more than 200 engagements between September 1942 and August 1943, where regulation equipment would have failed. Those communications coordinated airstrikes, artillery support, medical evacuations, and tactical withdrawals that saved thousands of lives. The exact number is impossible to calculate because nobody tracked how many Marines didn't die because their radios worked when they needed them. The official documentation attributed improved communications reliability to enhanced maintenance protocols and better supply chain management. Walsh's name appeared in no commendations. His innovation received no medals. The Marine Corps preferred it that way. Admitting that a corporal had solved a problem the Signal Corps couldn't fix was bad for institutional credibility. Eddie Walsh survived the war. He was discharged in December 1945 with the rank of sergeant and a Pacific Theater ribbon. No medals for the fishing line antennas, no recognition beyond what his fellow radio operators gave him, which was all he wanted anyway. He went back to Portland, Maine. His grandfather's fishing business had survived the war. Eddie worked the boats again, starting in January 1946. Same trawl lines, same equipment, same ocean. He married Sarah in March 1946. They had 4 kids. He never talked much about Guadalcanal. When asked, he'd say he operated radios and came home. That was enough. Once a year on September 14th, he'd receive letters from Jackson, Morrison, and other operators who'd been there. They'd write about their lives, their families, and sometimes about that morning when the B-17s came in and the fishing line antenna held, and 600 Marines didn't die because a corporal from Maine understood that physics worked the same everywhere, even in a jungle where nothing else did. In 1967, a military historian researching Marine Corps communications in the Pacific found references to unauthorized antenna modifications that had significantly improved reliability in jungle operations. The pattern was specific to units that had served on Guadalcanal in late 1942. The historian interviewed veterans and found Walsh through the 1st Marine Division Association. Walsh agreed to one interview. He explained the method, provided technical details, showed the original sketches he'd kept, then asked that his name not be prominently featured in any publication. The historian respected that request. The article published in 1969 in the Marine Corps Gazette attributed the innovation to unnamed NCOs in the 1st Marine Division signal units and included technical specifications for field-expedient antenna construction. The method itself lived longer than the man who invented it. Post-war analysis by Signal Corps engineers validated the concept. Monofilament line antennas were integrated into survival radio kits in 1952. The Vietnam War saw extensive use of fishing line antennas in jungle environments where traditional antennas failed. Modern military survival radios still include monofilament antenna wire as standard equipment. The principle hasn't changed in 80 years. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. And sometimes Marines in the jungle know more than engineers in laboratories. That's how innovation actually happens in war, not through committees reviewing proposals and engineers running simulations, through corporals who can't watch their friends die anymore because radios failed at the worst possible moment, through fishermen who learned to solve problems with line and knots because nobody was going to give them anything better, through men who risked court-martial to save lives and never asked for credit because credit didn't matter when Marines were counting on you to keep the radios working. Now, I know some of you watching this served. Maybe you were in the Pacific, maybe Korea, maybe Vietnam, or later. Maybe you remember what it was like when the approved equipment didn't work, and you had to figure it out yourself because nobody else was going to do it for you. That's what this story is really about. It's about the men who don't wait for permission when lives are on the line, the ones who see a problem and fix it even when the regulations say they're not supposed to, And if you appreciate hearing about these kinds of men, the ones who never made it into the official histories but changed the outcome anyway, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because there are hundreds more stories like Eddie Walsh's, and somebody needs to tell them before the men who lived them are gone. We're not just preserving history here. We're preserving the memory of the kind of ingenuity and courage that won the war, one fishing line antenna at a time. The official commendation finally came in 1958. The Marine Corps retroactively approved fishing line antennas as field-expedient communications equipment and credited the innovation to signal personnel who served on Guadalcanal in 1942. They didn't name Walsh specifically. They didn't have to. Every radio operator who'd been there knew whose idea it was. Walsh received a letter from the Commandant of the Marine Corps thanking him for his service and contributions to communications doctrine. He framed it and hung it in his garage next to photographs of fishing boats. Sarah asked him once why he kept it with the boat pictures instead of with his other Marine Corps memorabilia. He said it made sense to him. The boats taught him the skills. The Marines just gave him a place to use them. The Japanese learned about the fishing line antennas, too, but not until it was too late to matter. After the war, captured Japanese intelligence documents revealed that field commanders on Guadalcanal had reported unusual American communications reliability in jungle conditions starting in September 1942. Japanese radio intercept teams noted that American transmissions continued even after equipment damage that should have rendered radios inoperative. They theorized the Americans had some kind of advanced backup communications system. They never guessed it was fishing line and physics. By 1943, the fishing line antenna method had become standard field expedient procedure across the Pacific Theater. Radio operators carried spools of monofilament in their packs, along with regulation equipment. Installation time was under 5 minutes for trained personnel. The antennas could be rigged in jungle, beach, mountain, or urban terrain. They worked in rain, humidity, salt air, and conditions that destroyed metal antennas in days. And most importantly, they worked when regulation equipment failed, which in the Pacific meant they worked when it mattered most. There were limitations, of course. The fishing line antennas had lower signal strength than regulation equipment under ideal conditions. They required more careful installation to get the geometry right. They were vulnerable to being cut by shrapnel or knocked down by artillery. But ideal conditions didn't exist in the Pacific. Careful installation beat equipment that didn't work at all, and any antenna that lasted through one engagement was better than regulation equipment that corroded through before you needed it. Modern antenna theory validates everything Walsh figured out in September 1942. Monofilament fishing line has a dielectric constant between 2.2 and 2.5, which makes it an effective insulator for radio frequency applications. The material is chemically inert, resists saltwater corrosion, and maintains tensile strength in extreme humidity. At wavelengths used by tactical radios, the line acts as a waveguide that helps propagate the signal, even though the line itself isn't conductive. Walsh didn't know the academic terminology. He just knew that fishing line didn't corrode and metal antennas did, and when you're 7,000 miles from home watching your friends die because equipment failed, you use what works. The method spread beyond the Marines. Army signal units in the Pacific adopted it after joint operations on New Guinea in 1943. Navy beach landing teams used it for ship-to-shore communications. Air Force rescue teams carried monofilament for emergency radio antennas. By 1944, fishing line antennas were so common that supply depots in the Pacific routinely stocked spools of 20 and 30-pound test line in communications equipment sections. Officially designated as expedient antenna material, unofficially known as Walsh wire. among radio operators who knew the history. The innovation saved more than lives. It saved time, resources, and logistics capacity. Every fishing line antenna that worked meant one less regulation antenna that needed to be shipped 7,000 miles across the Pacific. One less supply flight carrying replacement parts, one less warehouse storing backup equipment. The material cost was effectively zero because fishing line was already in the supply chain for other purposes, and monofilament could be scavenged from a dozen different sources. The military-industrial complex never billed the government for Walsh's invention because the government never officially acknowledged needing it. If you're still with me, I want to take a moment to explain why I make these videos and why I'd appreciate your support. I'm not here to tell you the stories you already know. You've heard about D-Day, you've heard about Midway, you've heard about the big battles and the famous generals. What you haven't heard is how a corporal from Maine saved thousands of lives with fishing line and common sense. These are the stories that matter to me, and based on your comments and messages, they matter to you too. So, if you think more people should hear about men like Eddie Walsh, men who didn't wait for permission to do what needed doing, then please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps the algorithm show these videos to other folks who appreciate this kind of history. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and I love knowing that this community stretches from Maine to California and everywhere in between. Eddie Walsh died in 1991 at age 71. Heart failure, same as his father and grandfather before him. His obituary in the Portland Press-Herald mentioned that he served in the Pacific during World War II and operated commercial fishing boats for 45 years. It didn't mention fishing line antennas, improvised field repairs, or the airstrike that saved 600 Marines. Sarah knew he'd done something important on Guadalcanal, but he never told her exactly what. She found out at the funeral when 3 men in Marine Corps League uniforms showed up and explained to her that her husband had been one of the most important radio operators in the Pacific Theater, and most people would never know it. The method itself is still taught today, though most people don't know where it came from. Military survival schools teach expedient antenna construction using available materials. Ham radio operators use similar techniques for emergency communications. Disaster relief teams carry monofilament antenna wire in their equipment kits. The principle hasn't changed since 1942. When regulation equipment fails and lives depend on communications, you use what works and you figure out the theory later. Modern tactical radios are better than the SCR 300 Walsh used. They're lighter, more powerful, more resistant to environmental damage. But they still fail. Equipment always fails eventually. And when it does, soldiers and Marines fall back on the same kind of field-expedient solutions Walsh pioneered 80 years ago. That's the real legacy. Not the specific antenna design, but the mindset. The understanding that regulations are guidelines, not absolute limits. That innovation happens at the edge of what's approved, not in the center. That the men facing the problem usually know more about solving it than the men who wrote the manual. The fishing line is still taught at Marine Corps Communications School, though the instructors might not know the full story. It's covered in one class period during the Field Expedient Equipment module. Students learn to calculate wavelengths, strip antenna leads, make proper connections, ground the chassis. They practice setting up antennas using monofilament line in under 5 minutes. Some of them will use the skill in actual combat. Most won't. But all of them will carry the knowledge that when approved methods don't work, there are other options. That's what Walsh gave them. Options when they needed them most. The irony is that Walsh never wanted recognition. He'd done what needed doing because the alternative was watching Marines die. That was the whole calculation. The military eventually gave him credit anyway, decades later, in dry technical documents that attributed improved communications reliability to field innovations developed by signal personnel during the Guadalcanal campaign. His name appeared in a footnote in a 1978 Marine Corps manual on expedient communications. One footnote, that was enough. What matters more than credit is impact. Thousands of Marines came home from the Pacific because radios worked when they needed them to work. Airstrikes got called in. Artillery coordinates got transmitted. Casualty evacuations got requested. All because a corporal from Maine understood that fishing line resisted corrosion, and regulations weren't sacred when lives were at stake. That's the impact. That's what endures. If you served, you know what I'm talking about. You remember the times when the approved solution didn't work and somebody had to figure out something else. Maybe it was you. Maybe it was your sergeant or your squad mate or some specialist who everybody thought was crazy until his idea saved the day. That's what this channel is about, telling those stories before they're lost. Because the men who did these things aren't getting any younger, and once they're gone, the stories go with them unless somebody writes them down. So do me a favor. Share this video with someone who'd appreciate it. A veteran friend, a family member who served, your grandson who's interested in history. These stories matter, and they only survive if we pass them on. The official history of the Guadalcanal campaign mentions communications challenges in one paragraph. Equipment reliability issues complicated coordination efforts in jungle environments, requiring enhanced maintenance protocols and supply chain management. That's it. One paragraph covering 6 months of radio operators dying and equipment failing, and Walsh figuring out that fishing line worked better than anything the Signal Corps issued. The official history doesn't lie, exactly. It just doesn't tell the whole truth. It acknowledges the problem, credits improved protocols, and moves on to the next battle. What it doesn't mention is that the improved protocols were fishing line antennas rigged by a corporal who'd learned his skills on commercial boats in Maine and didn't care that the Signal Corps hadn't approved his method. That's why these stories matter. The official histories tell you what happened. They don't always tell you how or why or who made it possible. Eddie Walsh made it possible for hundreds of airstrikes to get called in when they needed to be called in. The official history credits improved communications. Both things are true, but one is more complete than the other. The last letter Walsh received from a fellow radio operator came in 1989. It was from Jackson, the private from Montana, who'd been one of the first to learn the fishing line antenna method. Jackson was dying. Cancer. He wrote to Walsh to say thank you. Not for teaching him the antenna technique, though he mentioned that. Thank you for showing me that doing the right thing mattered more than following the rules. That's what I carried with me my whole life. That's what I'm taking with me now, Walsh wrote back. He said Jackson had it backwards. Walsh had just been trying to keep radios working. Jackson and the others had been the ones brave enough to use an unauthorized method when officers were watching and careers could end over unauthorized modifications. They'd trusted him. That was the real courage. Jackson died in January 1990. Walsh attended the funeral in Billings, Montana. It was the first time he'd traveled more than 100 miles from Portland since 1946. Sarah asked him why this funeral mattered so much. Walsh said Jackson had been there on September 14th, when the fishing line antenna called in the B-17 strike. Jackson had understood what it meant when nobody else did. That mattered more than distance or convenience. At the funeral, Walsh met 6 other radio operators who'd served with Jackson in different units at different times. They all knew the fishing line antenna story. They'd all used the method at some point. They all credited Walsh with saving their lives or the lives of Marines they'd served with. Walsh listened to their stories and didn't say much. What was there to say? He'd rigged an antenna because his radio was dead and Marines were dying. They'd used the same technique because it worked. That was the whole story. Everything else was just details. The technical specifications for Walsh's fishing line antenna are preserved in the Marine Corps archives at Quantico. Document number S374, 1942, Field Expedient Antenna Construction using Monofilament Line. The document includes hand-drawn diagrams, wavelength calculations, installation procedures, and performance data collected from 47 different installations across 3 divisions. The diagrams are Walsh's originals, drawn in pencil on notebook paper in September 1942. The calculations show his work, including corrections where he'd made errors and fixed them. The performance data shows signal strength measurements, reliability percentages, and comparative analysis against regulation antennas. It's a masterclass in field engineering, all created by a man who'd never taken an engineering class in his life. Modern communications officers study that document at the Marine Corps Expeditionary Warfare School. It's used as an example of effective field innovation under combat conditions. The instructors explain the technical principles, walk through the installation procedures, and emphasize the importance of field expedient solutions when regulation equipment fails. Most of the students don't know Walsh's name. The document credits Signal Personnel, 1st Marine Division, Guadalcanal Campaign, 1942. That's close enough to the truth. The fishing line method saved Eddie Walsh's life one more time, though not in combat. In 1987, Walsh was fishing alone 40 miles off Portland when his boat's engine failed. Dead in the water, no power for the radio, weather turning bad. He rigged an emergency antenna using fishing line from his tackle box and a hand-crank emergency radio from the survival kit. Same technique he'd used 45 years earlier on Guadalcanal. The antenna worked. He made contact with the Coast Guard. They found him 3 hours later and towed him back to port. The Coast Guard officer who responded asked about the improvised antenna. Walsh explained the physics. The officer said he'd learned something similar in survival school, but had never seen it used in the field. Walsh didn't mention Guadalcanal. He just said, fishing line worked better than people thought if you understood the principles. That was Eddie Walsh. The same solution to the same problem 45 years apart because the physics didn't change and the principles didn't change, and when you needed communications and regulation equipment failed, you used what worked. The Pacific Ocean off Maine wasn't that different from the Pacific Ocean off Guadalcanal when it came to basic physics. Now we're coming to the end here, and I want to leave you with one final thought. Eddie Walsh never won a Medal of Honor. He never commanded troops in combat. He never led a charge or captured an enemy position. What he did was figure out how to keep radios working when they needed to work. That's it. That's the whole story. But those radios coordinated airstrikes that saved thousands of lives. Those radios called in artillery that stopped enemy advances. Those radios requested medical evacuations that brought wounded Marines home alive. Walsh didn't pull a trigger or throw a grenade. He kept the radios working, and sometimes that matters more than anything else. If you appreciated this story, if you're glad somebody took the time to tell it before it was lost, then please subscribe. Click that button right now, because I've got dozens more stories like this one. Stories about men who didn't make the official histories but changed the outcome anyway. Stories about ingenuity and courage and doing what needed to be done even when the regulations said you weren't supposed to. These stories matter. The men who lived them matter. And the only way these stories survive is if enough people care to listen and pass them on. Eddie Walsh was buried in Portland, Maine, in December 1991. Marine Corps Honor Guard, flag folded and presented to Sarah. 3 volleys fired over the grave. Standard military funeral. Dignified and respectful, and exactly what Walsh would have wanted. At the reception afterward, his grandson asked Sarah what grandfather had done in the war. Sarah told him what she knew. He operated radios on Guadalcanal. He helped coordinate communications. He came home in 1945 and went back to fishing. The grandson wanted more details. What battles was he in? What did he do exactly? Sarah said she didn't know all the details, but 3 Marines at the funeral had told her that Eddie saved their lives, and that was enough to know. One of those Marines was 72-year-old James Morrison, same Morrison who'd helped Walsh spread the fishing line antenna method in September 1942. Morrison told the grandson a version of the story, simplified for a 14-year-old, focused on the problem-solving and the courage to try something new when approved methods failed. The grandson listened, asked questions, wanted to understand how fishing line could work as an antenna. Morrison drew diagrams on a napkin, explained wavelengths and frequencies and signal propagation. The same diagrams Walsh had drawn 49 years earlier in a jungle 7,000 miles away. The grandson kept that napkin. He joined the Marine Corps in 2001, served in Iraq and Afghanistan as a communications specialist, used expedient antenna techniques he'd learned in training, techniques that traced directly back to his grandfather's innovations on Guadalcanal. He never rigged a fishing line antenna in combat, but he carried monofilament in his pack just in case. When asked why, he'd explain that his grandfather had pioneered the method in World War II, and it seemed right to carry on the tradition. His squad mates thought he was superstitious. He didn't correct them. Some things didn't need explaining. The grandson retired from the Marines in 2021 as a gunnery sergeant. 20 years of service, 4 deployments, more communications equipment than his grandfather could have imagined. But the principles were the same. When regulation equipment failed, you improvised. When lives depended on communications, you made it work, no matter what it took. When the approved methods weren't good enough, you found something better. That was the legacy. Not fishing lines specifically, but the mindset that created the solution when solutions were needed most. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to a story about a man most people have never heard of who changed the Pacific War in ways the official histories don't record. If you got something out of this, if you learned something or felt something or just appreciate knowing that men like Eddie Walsh existed, then do 3 things for me. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me what you thought. These stories only survive if we pass them on, and you're part of that process now. You're part of keeping the memory alive. That matters more than you know. The fishing line antenna is still taught. The method is still used. The innovation endures. But more important than the technical solution is the example. The example of a man who saw a problem, understood the cost of not solving it, and did what needed to be done despite regulations that said he wasn't supposed to. That's the real story. That's what we need to remember. Not just what Eddie Walsh did, but why he did it and what it meant for everyone who came after. From a muddy shell crater on Guadalcanal to the Marine Corps Communications School at Quantico, from 60 feet of fishing line in 1942 to modern tactical communications in 2024, the line runs straight and true. Eddie